My name is Bradley Thornfield, and until 3 months ago, I thought I knew exactly who I was. I was 35 years old, a furniture restorer in Denver, a man who believed that honesty and craftsmanship mattered more than money or status. But everything I believed about myself, about my family, about my very existence, shattered the night my father slapped me in front of 200 people and the cameras of the world. It was supposed to be a celebration, my father's 70th birthday at his mountain estate in Aspen, the kind of place that looked like it was built to impress magazine editors and intimidate everyone else. The chandeliers sparkled like ice. The waiters moved like ghosts through the crowd. And my father, Harrison Thornfield, stood in the center of it all, tall, silver-haired, perfectly tailored, the image of success. To everyone else, he was a real estate legend. To me, he was the man who'd spent my whole life reminding me that I was a disappointment. He wanted his eldest son to be a titan of business, to carry the Thornfield name through headlines and skyscrapers. Instead, he got me, a man who preferred sawdust and silence to suits and sales calls. I had restored something for him, a desk that had belonged to his father, or at least that's what I'd always been told. 3 months of work went into that thing. I matched every grain of mahogany, polished every brass handle, replaced nothing unless I had to. It was the most beautiful piece I had ever made. That night, I hoped maybe finally it would be enough. But it wasn't. When he called me across the ballroom, voice cutting through the music like a blade, I already felt the knot in my chest. "Bradley," he said, "come tell everyone about your little hobby shop." His tone was light, joking, but the cruelty underneath it was something only I could hear. Laughter rippled through the guests, polite and poisonous. I tried to steer it away. "Actually, Dad, I have a gift for you," I said quietly. "It's in your study." He didn't let me finish. "What could you possibly give me?" he said loudly. "That I couldn't buy 10 times over?" People chuckled again, waiting for the punchline. Then he looked at me, really looked, and said, "You're 35, unmarried, broke, living above a workshop that smells like failure." Felt like the air left the room. Then came the moment that would follow me for the rest of my life. He turned toward the crowd, raised his voice so everyone could hear, and said, "I'm done pretending this boy is a Thornfield." His hand moved before my brain even caught up. The slap echoed through the hall like a gunshot. For a second, no one moved. Not a sound, not a breath. Then I heard the whispers. Phones lifted, flashes flickered, cameras recorded. I didn't say a word. I just walked out, through the crowd of guests who pretended not to look at me. My mother didn't follow. She just stood there beside him, frozen, like someone trapped inside a painting. By the time I reached my truck, my face still burned and my heart felt hollow. I loaded the wrapped desk into the truck bed. The gift I had built for him, now nothing more than a reminder of my stupidity, and drove off into the night. It took less than 2 hours for the video to hit the internet. Billionaire disowns his son at birthday gala. The headline ran on every gossip site by morning. I didn't even check my phone. I just drove back to Denver, through the dark mountain roads, trying to convince myself it didn't matter. But it did. When I finally pulled into my workshop, a converted tire shop that smelled like sawdust and linseed oil, the silence was heavy. This was my refuge, the one place in the world that ever made sense. I sat at my workbench, staring at the half-finished rocking chair I'd been building for a client. The curves of the wood caught the light in a way that always calmed me. I ran my hand along the grain, breathing in the scent of the oil. That scent was the only thing that grounded me that night. I told myself I didn't need him. I told myself I was free. But it didn't feel like freedom. It felt like losing gravity, like falling without end. By sunrise, I still hadn't slept. I tried to distract myself by cleaning the shop, but the silence was too loud. Every corner reminded me of how little I had. Every tool, every scratch on the floor, all of it whispered the same thing. You'll never be enough. Then the knock came, soft, hesitant. When I opened the door, my Uncle Graham stood there, my father's younger brother. I hadn't seen him in years. He looked older, thinner, but his eyes were still sharp. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation and said quietly, "You shouldn't be alone right now." He placed a small wooden box on the table. "Your grandfather's," he said. "He wanted you to have it. Your father ignored that part of the will." I opened it slowly. Inside were old letters, photographs, and a fountain pen with the initials E.T. engraved on the cap. Edward Thornfield, my grandfather. A man I barely remembered but had always been told I resembled. "There's something you need to read," Graham said, handing me one of the letters. "But you're not going to like it." The paper was yellowed and brittle, dated 1990, the year I was born. My grandfather's handwriting was elegant but trembling. It began, "If you're reading this, the truth can't stay buried any longer." I felt my pulse quicken. The letter went on about a decision made to protect the family name, about a boy who must never know who his real father is. When I looked up, Graham wouldn't meet my eyes. "What is this supposed to mean?" I asked. He sighed. "Bradley, Harrison isn't your biological father." I laughed, a hollow, instinctive sound. "What? That's ridiculous." But his face didn't change. He pointed at another letter, this one written by my mother. Same date, same desperate tone. "We agreed to raise him as ours. He deserves love, not scandal. No one must know." I stood there, my whole body buzzing like static. Every memory, every cruel word, every moment I'd wondered why he never looked at me like a son, suddenly twisted into focus. I didn't feel angry yet. I just felt empty. "Who is he then?" I whispered. Graham hesitated. "You wouldn't know him. He worked for the family once. Your mother was young. It was complicated." Complicated. That word again. The one adults use when they want to bury truth under manners. I stared at the old letters on the table, the handwriting of people who had built an empire out of deception. All my life, I had fought for my father's respect. But now I realized it was never mine to earn. The man I'd called father wasn't even mine by blood. And somehow, that made the slap hurt less and more at the same time. Graham stayed with me for a while that morning. We didn't talk much. When he finally left, he said something that stayed in my head long after the door closed. "Sometimes, Bradley, being disowned is the only honest thing that ever happens to us." When he was gone, I sat at the workbench again, staring at the rocking chair, the letters, the box. The sunlight filtered through the dusty windows, cutting lines across the floor like scars. And for the first time in my life, I wondered not who I was supposed to be, but who I really was. I didn't sleep that night. Couldn't. The letters sat on the table like ghosts, whispering questions I wasn't ready to answer. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my father's face. That cold satisfaction when he told the world I wasn't his son. And now I knew. Maybe he'd meant it literally. Morning sunlight crept through the workshop windows, catching the dust in the air. Everything looked the same, but it wasn't. I wasn't. I picked up the letter again. My grandfather's handwriting looped across the page, fading in places. He wrote about mistakes, guilt, a truth buried for the sake of the family. But one sentence wouldn't leave my mind. "The boy will grow up believing he belongs, but blood has a way of finding its way home." I didn't know what that meant, or who my real father could be. All I knew was that the Thornfield name, the one that had defined and destroyed me, wasn't even mine. By noon, I'd packed a small bag. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't stay there. I needed answers, not pity. Before I left, I noticed something strange inside the wooden box Graham had brought. Beneath the letters, wrapped in old newspaper, was a photograph. It was taken sometime in the early 90s. My mother, smiling beside a man I didn't recognize. He looked maybe 25, dark hair, kind eyes, a mechanic's uniform. On the back, written in my mother's handwriting, were two words, Jacob Carroll. I whispered the name aloud, and it felt familiar somehow. Not the name itself, but the way it sounded, like something that had been sitting at the edge of my memory for years. I spent the rest of the day searching old business records online. My mother had been my father's personal assistant before they married. If Jacob worked for the Thornfields, Maybe his name was buried somewhere in their company archives. It didn't take long. There it was, Jacob Carroll, Maintenance Department, Thornfield Properties, 1989 to 1990, the year I was born. I stared at the screen until the letters blurred. Then I saw it, a small address next to his employee record. Durango, Colorado, 3 hours south. By evening, I was on the road. The highway cut through endless plains and low hills, the kind of quiet that makes your thoughts too loud. I replayed my life like a film I suddenly realized was built on lies. Every moment with my father, every time he looked at me like I was someone else, now made a cruel kind of sense. The slap, the anger, the distance. Maybe, deep down, he had always known. When I reached Durango, the sun was setting behind the mountains. I pulled into a small diner just off the main road. The sign buzzed faintly, Carol's Diner. My stomach turned. Could it be that simple? Inside, it smelled like coffee and fried eggs. A woman in her 60s smiled as I sat at the counter. "What can I get you, hon?" she asked. I hesitated. "Actually, I'm looking for someone. Jacob Carroll. Does he still live around here?" Her smile faltered. "You're not from around here, are you?" "No," I said. I stopped myself. What was I supposed to say? I didn't even know who I was anymore. She looked at me a long moment, then nodded toward the back window. "You'll find him across the road. The auto shop with the blue door. He's there most days." My hands were shaking when I thanked her and stepped back into the evening air. The auto shop sat half-buried under vines. The sign faded but still legible. Carroll and Son Repairs. A bell jingled when I pushed the door open. The air smelled of oil and metal and memory. Behind the counter, a man looked up. Mid-60s, strong shoulders, hair gone gray but eyes sharp and gentle. "Can I help you?" he asked. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. For a second, I just stood there, staring, because I could see it. In the tilt of his chin, the shape of his eyes, the curve of his jaw, I saw myself. He frowned slightly. "You all right, son?" That word, son, hit like a tremor. I think you might have known my mother," I said carefully. Eleanor Reed." He froze. His wrench slipped from his hand and clattered on the floor. For a long time he didn't move. Then he whispered, "Eleanor." I nodded. She worked for the Thornfields." He walked around the counter slowly, studying my face as if it were a puzzle. His hands trembled. "What's your name?" "Bradley," I said. Then, quietly, "Bradley Thornfield." He shut his eyes like someone trying not to fall apart. When he opened them, they were shining. "I used to call you that," he said softly, "before they took you away." The room tilted. "What are you talking about?" He sat down heavily on a stool, his voice rough with years of silence. "Your mother and I were in love. We planned to marry. But when she got pregnant, her family panicked. The Thornfields were powerful. She worked for Harrison then, your father, I guess. They said if she wanted a future, she had to disappear. And so did I." He looked at me, his eyes wet but steady. "I tried to fight it. I wrote letters, I went to their house. They threatened me, said if I didn't leave the state, they'd ruin me. So I left. But I never stopped thinking about you." Couldn't breathe. The air felt thick, like the walls were closing in. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an old photograph, worn, folded 100 times. It was me, maybe 1 year old, sitting on my mother's lap. "She sent this once," he said. "Said you were safe." That was the last I ever heard. I didn't realize I was crying until I saw the tears on my hands. All my life I thought I was the failure, the disappointment, the unwanted son. But none of it had been my fault. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The shop was quiet except for the ticking of the clock and the sound of cars passing outside. Finally, he said, "You don't owe me anything, Bradley. I needed to see you once before I die. To know that you made it." But something in me broke at that. "No," I said. "I've spent my whole life chasing a man who never loved me. You were the one who did. You just never got the chance." He smiled then, small, fragile, but real. We talked for hours. About my mother, about the past, about everything I had missed. He showed me the workshop he'd built with his own hands, the same way I had built mine. Every tool, every workbench, it was like looking at a reflection of my soul. When I finally stood to leave, he gripped my shoulder. "You have her heart," he said. "But the hands, those are mine." I laughed through the tears. Guess I finally know where I got them. Outside, the sky had turned deep blue. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, whether I'd tell my mother, whether the world would ever know. But for the first time in my life I felt whole. Not because I had found blood, but because I had found truth. And truth, I realized, is heavier than shame but lighter to carry. As I drove away from the shop, the lights behind me fading into the night, I glanced at the photograph again. My mother, young and happy. The man beside her, the one who had waited decades just to say my name. I whispered it out loud. Jacob Carroll. And for the first time, the name didn't sound foreign. Sounded like mine. The drive back to Denver felt shorter than before. Maybe because the road no longer led me away from something, but toward it. For the first time in my life, I wasn't running from shame or chasing approval. I was just existing, and that felt strangely peaceful. Still, I knew what I had to do next. There was one person left who had to face the truth. My mother. I hadn't spoken to her since the night of the party. She hadn't called, hadn't texted, hadn't defended me. But after what I'd learned, I couldn't just disappear without hearing her side. When I reached the city, I parked outside her townhouse and sat there for a long time, staring at the front door. The lights were on. Shadows moved inside. She was home. My hands were shaking when I rang the bell. The door opened slowly. She looked older than I remembered, or maybe it was the guilt in her eyes that made her seem smaller. "Bradley," she whispered, "I didn't think you'd come." "I almost didn't," I said quietly. "But I found something. Actually, someone." Her face drained of color. "Graham," she said under her breath. "He gave me the letters," I replied. "And I met him. Jacob." She closed her eyes, as if the name itself hurt. Then she stepped aside. "Come in." The house was spotless, silent. The same pictures still hung on the walls, the family portraits, the vacations, the staged smiles. A museum of pretending. We sat across from each other in the living room. She reached for my hand, but I pulled away. "I just need you to tell me the truth," I said. "All of it." For a long time she didn't speak. The clock ticked softly. Then her voice came, trembling. "I was 22, she said. "I'd just started working for your father. He wasn't married yet. He was charming, powerful. Everyone wanted his approval. But he wasn't the man people think he was. He had rules, walls. Everything had to be perfect." Her eyes filled with tears. "When I met Jacob, it was the first time someone saw me. Really saw me. He was kind, simple, real. I loved him. But when I got pregnant, everything fell apart. Harrison found out. He offered to fix everything, but only one way." Her voice cracked. "He said if I didn't agree, Jacob would lose his job, his home, his life. He promised to raise you as his own, but only if I never saw Jacob again." I felt my throat tighten. "And you agreed?" She nodded, crying now. "I thought I was protecting you. I thought it would give you a better life. But I never imagined he'd turn that love into punishment." I stared at her, the woman who'd given me life but also lied to me for 35 years. Part of me wanted to yell, to demand how she could have let him treat me like that. But another part understood. She was young, scared, alone, and sometimes survival looks like betrayal. She reached for me again, and this time I didn't pull away. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "You deserved the truth long before this." I held her hand, the silence between us thick with years of unspoken things. Then I said, "He disowned me that night, told the world I wasn't a Thornfield. I guess in some way he was right." She looked up sharply. "Don't say that. You are my son." I smiled faintly. "I know, but the name never made me one. The love did." We sat there until the clock struck midnight, two people bound by truth and loss. When I finally stood to leave, She walked me to the door and said, "What will you do now?" I looked at her, at the woman who had spent her life trapped in someone else's world, and I said, "I'm going to build my own." Weeks passed. The scandal faded from the headlines. The Thornfields moved on or pretended to. Harrison never reached out, and I never expected him to. But I didn't need him anymore. I renamed my workshop Carol and Thornfield Restoration. 2 names. 2 histories. 1 truth. Jacob came to visit sometimes. We didn't talk about the years we lost. We just worked, side by side. He'd hum old songs while sanding wood, and I'd tell him about clients, about designs, about life. Felt ordinary, and that was the beauty of it. One evening, he showed me how to fix a cracked tabletop without replacing the entire piece. "You see," he said, running his hand over the seam, "Wood remembers where it broke. You can't erase the scar. You can only make it part of the design." I looked at him and smiled. "Maybe people are the same way." He nodded. "The strongest pieces are the ones that been broken and rebuilt right." That line stayed with me. Months later, a journalist reached out, asking for an interview about the disowned son who rebuilt his life. I said no, not because I was ashamed, but because I didn't owe the world my pain. Some truths aren't for headlines. They're for healing. On the anniversary of that night, I drove back to Aspen. The Thornfield estate stood as cold and magnificent as ever. I didn't go inside. I just left something at the gate, the restored desk. A note sat on top. "This was never yours. It was always mine." Then I drove away, not looking back. As the mountains faded behind me, I realized the real inheritance I'd received wasn't money or a name. It was clarity. I learned that sometimes the people who hurt you aren't villains. They're just prisoners of their own lies. And the ones who love you may not have power, or wealth, or even courage. But they give you truth, and that's what sets you free. My name is Bradley Carroll Thornfield. Not by blood, not by legacy, but by choice. And sometimes that's the only kind of family that matters.